Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in part 11 of Hume's dialogues. In part 10, we saw so far 4 solutions to the problem of evil. We've had objections to 3 of them. God is incomprehensible, we'll know in the afterlife, there's more good than evil. And we left off at the end of part 10 with Philo's solution that God is amoral. So now in part 11, we pick up with Cleanthes. I don't mind admitting, said Cleanthes, that I've been inclined to suspect that the frequent repetition of the word infinite is what leads to these problems. It's really a superlative. If you misunderstand that, you're going to get into all kinds of difficulties. It's a superlative like admirable, excellent, or superlatively great, wise, holy. Those are sufficient to fill the imaginations of men. Anything that goes further than they do has 2 drawbacks. 1, it leads to absurdities, and it has no influence on our feelings. The way someone who feels about God who is infinitely great is the same as if you say he's superlatively great. But you avoid some of the problems that Philo thinks he's brought up with. God's not infinite. He's just greater than us. He's the object of our admiring wonder, but he's finite like us. And he may have to choose a lesser evil to avoid a greater evil. Inconveniences may be put up with in order to reach a desirable end. So you suffer through inconveniences to reach a greater good. Benevolence, guided by wisdom, and limited by necessity, can produce such a world as the one we have. You, Philo, who are so prompt at launching views and reflections and analogies, I'd be glad to hear at length and without interruption your opinion of this new theory of mine. Now, my opinions, replied Philo, aren't worth being made a mystery of. So without more ado, I'll tell you what occurs to me regarding this present subject, this solution here. It must be admitted, I think, that if a being who had very limited intelligence and was utterly unacquainted with our universe were assured that it was a product of a being who, though finite, is very good, wise, and powerful, this would lead him beforehand to accept that. So if I had something in a box, you can't see it yet, and I say, what was made in the box is sublime. When you see what's in there, you'll know it was made by a genius. And if you're convinced of that, and then I show you what's in the box, you'll say, oh, you're right. It's amazing. That's you might say that have with art sometimes. If you go to an art gallery and someone says the next room is filled with paintings done by a master, and you go in there and it looks like someone tipped over a paint can on accident, but since you were told ahead of time it's a master, you'll say brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I see the human condition. We're like a paint can accidentally knocked over on canvas. And you'll think that, right? But if you were just told nothing, and you go in and you see a cacophony, you'd say, this was made by a child. How much is that going for? So if we start that way, yes, then we'd expect that way. But supposing this person were brought into our world, still sure it was the workmanship of that sublime and benevolent being, he might be surprised at the discrepancy with what he expected, but he wouldn't retract his view. So if you start off with God is infinite, the things you see in the world won't change your opinion. He would be aware of his own blindness, ignorance, and must admit that these phenomena may have explanations, but he'll never be able to understand. But suppose this creature is not, as we are not, convinced in advance of a supreme intelligence. He may be fully convinced of the narrow limits of his understanding, but this won't help make an inference concerning the goodness or superior powers, because he has made that inference from what he knows. The more exaggerated his weakness and ignorance, the more cautious you make him. So if you say to someone, you just don't understand it because you're so limited, and what God is doing is so above you. If they go into it ahead of time thinking that there is a God like that, then they would say, yeah, you're right. This must be amazing. I just don't get it. But if they're coming at it with the question, I don't know if there even is a God. Show me the evidence. And they see a world filled with misery and wickedness. And on top of that, you tell them, plus your reasoning skills are really weak. Then they would say, well, all the more then I can't conclude God exists because my reasoning skills are so weak. If I showed you a house or palace and there wasn't one convenient or agreeable apartment where the windows, doors, fireplaces, passages, stairs, and the whole arrangement of the building were the source of noise, confusion, fatigue, darkness, and the extremes of heat and cold, you would certainly blame the planning of the building without any further examination, right? I take you to a building and it's one of those crooked buildings, like the hallways get narrower and narrower and narrower down to like a tiny little door. The stairs are wobbly. Windows can't shut because they're made at a off angle. This is poorly designed, you'd say, without even thinking about it. It'd be no use for the architect to show up. He overhears you and shows up and says, no, let me explain to you. I made the windows crooked because the door was crooked. I want them to match. Well, why is the door crooked? Well, you see how the stairs are wobbly. I had to match the stairs to the door. Well, why are the stairs wobbly? And you just keep going through this. You wouldn't end up saying, oh, okay, I see. He made everything bad because some other thing was bad. It only makes things worse to alter one detail while leaving the other parts unchanged. But you would still say in general that if the architect had had skill and good intentions, he would have planned the whole building and interrelated in parts in such a way as to remedy all or most of these inconveniences. His ignorance of such a plan will never convince you that it's impossible. That God couldn't figure it out doesn't mean the finite God of clean things, doesn't mean it can't be figured out. And that's that's the response to this of the fifth solution given. Even if God were finite, you would expect a better world than this. A finite architect can do better than this. So he says again, I repeat, is the world considered overall and as it appears to us in life different from what a limited being like a man would expect beforehand from even just a superlatively, not infinite, a superlatively benevolent God? It must be a strange prejudice to assert that it isn't. And from this, I conclude that however consistent the world may be with the idea of such a God, it can never provide us with the inference of his existence. If you come to a convinced God exists, it may not change your mind, but if you don't have that answer one way or the other yet, you would never conclude God from what you see around you. Conjectures, even when infinity is excluded from God's attributes, may perhaps be sufficient to prove a consistency, but they can never be foundations for any inference. There seem to be four circumstances on which all or most of our troubles, the troubles that beset conscious creatures, depend. So now he's going to give four proofs that the world is filled with natural evil. For anyone who doubts that. And if any one of these tiny things had been different, and God, if he's great, could have made them different, then the world would have had so much less suffering. Natural evil is not necessary. And I think that surprises students. They assume that natural evils, old age, sickness, death, toil, strife, famine, plague, war, all those things are necessary. But no, they're not. They could be changed. Life could be changed so you didn't suffer. What are these? Now, we know so little about life that even if a small thing were changed, we cannot always be sure of what the outcome would be. The human understanding and this deep ignorance and obscurity ought to be skeptical, or at least cautious, and oughtn't to accept any hypothesis, whatever, especially ones that aren't supported by any appearance of probability. I claim that this is the case with regard to all the causes of evil and the circumstances on which it depends. None of them appears to human reason to be necessary or unavoidable. You could avoid all the causes of suffering, First, the circumstance that introduces evil is the device or arrangement of the animal creation, by which pains as well as pleasures are employed to rouse creature to action and make them alert in the great work of self-preservation. Now, it seems to human understanding that pleasure alone would have been sufficient for that purpose. All animals are constantly in a state of enjoyment, but when they're urged to any of the necessities of nature, such as thirst, hunger, weariness, instead of pain, they feel a lessening of pleasure. Why couldn't that have been how things were designed? You don't need pain to say, time for sleep, time to drink some water, time to eat food. Men pursue pleasure as eagerly as they avoid pain. Or anyway, they could have been so constituted that this was true of them. So it seems clearly possible to carry on the business of life without any pain whatsoever. And if animals could be free of it for 1 hour, then they could be free for it all the time. If 1 hour, why not 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours? You could just be free of pain. You're used to it, so you maybe can't imagine it, but it doesn't make it not possible. It required a particular arrangement of the human organs to produce pain. Shall we conjecture then, without any appearance of reason for it, that such an arrangement was necessary? Not at all. Could have arranged them differently so you didn't have pain. So no pain is necessary. And you can think through the things like, well, what about when you die? Well, you could go to sleep in the evening and just not wake up. No pain. So no pain is necessary. Second, but a capacity for pain would not produce pain if it weren't for something else. So you could have the capacity for pain. Maybe banging a hammer on your hand will always produce pain. But that doesn't mean your hand needs to be banged with hammers. The world is being governed by general laws, and this seems to be in no way necessary for a very perfect being. If it is true that if each thing that happens was caused by an individual volition on God's part, the course of nature would be perpetually broken, but there would be no dependable regularities. So if God, every time something you're about to bang your hand with a hammer, a divine hand comes in the middle and stops it, well, then we couldn't study laws of nature. There'd be constant interference. But what if those were secret divine interventions? In short, might not God exterminate all misfortune, wherever it's to be found, and make everything all good through judiciously placed individual volitions, and thus without any preparation or long chain of causes and effects? Secret divine intervention to come up and avoid all these problems, and you never even know what happened, right? And you can think of examples of courses of life changed so that entire disasters are averted. And you never know what was due to the hand of God. Besides, we should bear in mind that in the present arrangement of the world, the course of nature, though supposedly to be entirely regular, appears to us not to be so. Many events that we see don't seem regular, and we don't know how to understand them. So even the argument that if God intervened, it would ruin order isn't necessarily true. Countless kinds of happenings whose causes are unknown and variable, for example, health and sickness, common tempest, have a great influence both on the fortunes of particular persons and the prosperity of whole communities. So a being who knows the secret workings of the universe might easily, by particular volitions, turn all these happenings to the good of mankind and make the whole world happy without revealing himself in any operation. A fleet whose purposes were useful might always get a fair wind. Good rulers might enjoy sound health and long life. Persons born to power and authority might be endowed with good temperaments and virtuous dispositions. A few things like that, and you would change so much of human history. Some small touches given to Caligula's brain in his infancy might have converted him to a Trajan, a better Caesar. one wave of a little finger than the rest, by burying Caesar and his fortune at the bottom of the ocean, might have restored liberty to considerable part of humankind. So Caesar does drown. You might remember from Brutus' speech. He talks about how Caesar was going to drown and he had to save him. Was that Cassius? Yeah, that was Cassius, in convincing Brutus to kill Caesar. So maybe Cassius, he looked the other way, Caesar's starting to drown, and Cassius hears an interesting bird call and looks over and looks back and is all, oh, see, where's Caesar? And he never becomes emperor. The Roman Empire doesn't change from a republic to an empire. Freedoms are preserved, and no one even knows, right? That there wasn't a bird. It was a divine intervention that made it sound like a bird. And he looked over there. So if 2 and 1, it seems inevitable that our misfortunes will arise from various collisions of matter. Even if 2 and 1 are true, isn't matter finite and limited and causes harms? Well, the third of the 4 factors I propose to mention is this: the great frugality with which all powers and organs and capacities of all animals is so organized. The creator of the world seems to be so frugal in giving us benefits. Every animal has the endowments it needs, but these are given with such careful economy, giving each creature only the bare necessities for its survival. And if anything considerable is taken from them, the creature is entirely destroyed. Wherever one power is increased, there is proportionally less of other powers. Animals that excel in speed are very commonly lacking in strength. Those that have both are either imperfect in some of their senses or oppressed with most craving wants. The human species, whose great excellence is reason and foresight, has more needs and fewer bodily advantages than any of the other creatures. Think of how humans would be situated if they were without clothes, without weapons, without food, without lodging, without any convenience of life, except what they owe their own skill and hard work. We'd be in a bad situation. Most of us couldn't survive like that. We're not Bear Grylls. In short, nature seems to have calculated exactly what her creatures need, and like a stern employer, has granted them little more than the powers or endowments that are strictly sufficient to meet those needs. An indulgent parent would have provided a great deal extra. Think of a mom who's sending off her kid to college, a caring mom, right? And she's adding in extra underwear. Make sure you have clean underwear, and extra soap. And here's a second lunch just in case you forget first lunch, right? Not saying, well, here's a slice of bread and you can get a butter packet at campus to put on your slice of bread. We have not been left in such a condition where every course of life is surrounded with precipices to such an extent that the least departure from the true path is bound to involve us in misery and wickedness, or misery and ruin. Some reserve, some emergency fund could have been provided to ensure our happiness. If his power is extremely limited, he'd have done better to create fewer animals and have endowed these with more means for being happy. So instead of making, let's say, 1,000 kinds of animals that are meagerly endowed, make 100 that have lots of success. So in order to remedy the misfortunes of human life, I don't require that man should have the wings of an eagle, the swiftness of the stag, the force of the ox, the arms of the lion. Well, pretty close, but the scales of the crocodile or rhinoceros. Much less do I demand the intelligence of an angel. I will settle for an increase in one single power or capacity. He thinks one thing would have changed all of humanity. That is simply this: a greater liking for work. If humans were made vigorous, full of activity of mind, more constant tendency to get on with business, the whole species would naturally be in a much better condition, much better able to cultivate themselves. Almost all the moral evils of life, as well as its natural evils, arise from idleness. And if our species had been built so as to be inherently free of this vice or infirmity, the immediate result would have been the perfect cultivation of land, the improvement of arts and manufactures, the exact performance of every office and duty. Now it's interesting, right? Because that was indeed the first command given to man. Be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion. You have to do work. Had they kept that command, Philo's saying, they would have been in a great situation. But precisely because they're born breaking that command, we get all the miseries you can think about. But as hardworkingness is a power, and indeed the most valuable of all powers, nature seems to be determined to follow her usual policy and bestow it on men with a very sparing hand, and to punish him severely for not having enough of it. So you're given very little hardworkingness, and you're punished greatly for not having more. Life will not be merciful to you. She has built him in such a way that nothing but the strongest need can force him to work. Only the greatest need will get you off the couch to turn off Netflix. The electricity went out. My Netflix is gone. What do I have to do? That'll get you out working. So here our demands can be agreed to be very humble, and thus all the more reasonable if we require the endowments of sharper intelligence and wiser judgment. We might be told that we were impiously claiming to break the order of nature. So he's not asking for the list he mentioned, just an inclination to hard work. That will protect us from so much. And then fourth, last one, the fourth factor leading to the misery and misfortune of the universe is the inaccurate workmanship of all the workings and principles of the great machine of nature. Greater attention to natural details would have avoided suffering. It must be admitted that the most parts of the universe seem to serve some purpose, and in most cases, the removal of a part would produce a visible defect on the whole. The parts all hang together, and you can't change one without affecting the rest. But at the same time, it must be observed that none of these parts or powers, however useful, are so accurately adjusted that they keep precisely within the limits of their usefulness. All of them are apt, much of the time, to run to extremes. So if you just had less extremes in nature, you'd avoid so much suffering. The winds are needed to blow away smoke and fog, but they often become hurricanes. You don't need hurricanes, that's extreme. Rains are necessary, but they often become either droughts, no rain at all, or excessive. I mean, there's parts of the states that have too much water, and they want to know, how do we get rid of our water? And then there's our area, which doesn't have enough water. We're fighting with other states to get water. So it seems to be one or the other. Too much water, not enough water. Heat is needed for life. Too much heat burns down. The passions of the mind, ambition, vanity, love, are useful. That's part of the work needed to get out there, as you have ambition, but they often become excessive. That's what Caesar was charged with, being ambitious. Everything in the universe, however advantageous, frequently becomes pernicious through being too much or too little. And that could have been made different. And with these four things combined, almost, he hedged his bet, most or all natural evil depends. The living creatures were incapable of feeling pain. The world were governed by particular volitions, secret divine interventions. Animals were endowed with a large stock of powers and faculties beyond what they strictly need for survival. And the various springs and principles of the universe were so accurately devised as to preserve always the temperate middle level and never go to extremes. This, shall we say then, the universe could have been easily designed to be different in those respects. And let us allow that if the goodness of God could be established by any respectable a priori argument, these phenomena, however unfortunate, wouldn't be sufficient to undercut his goodness. So he's back to this idea. If you came to the world knowing God exists, then you would explain those things in the world. But if you came to the world not decided on that issue, nothing you see would push you towards belief in God. The conclusion that God is good cannot result from skepticism, but much arise from the phenomenon and from our confidence in the reasoning through which we draw these conclusions. So we can't say, since we don't know, we're going to assume God is good. Skepticism. We have to say, to assume God is good, to conclude God is good, we need proof. And if we look around the universe, what an immense profusion of beings, animated and organized, conscious and active. You admire this prodigious variety and fruitfulness, but look a little more closely at these living creatures and how hostile and destructive they are to each other, how contemptible or odious they are. So you get this big gaze and you see a beautiful sunset over the desert, and you're inspired. Well, look more closely, right? And you'll see creatures in misery and hunger and thirst, hunting each other, devouring each other, right? That's what you see when you look more closely at the sunset. So he says here, the Manichaean system, remember the Manichaeans, Augustine? According to which the universe has two principles, one good, one evil, comes to mind as a possible hypothesis. No doubt it is in some respects very attractive, because you could explain evil by this ultimate evil principle. But if, on the other hand, we think about the perfect uniformity and agreement of the parts of the universe, we shan't discover in it any signs of a malevolent being's battle against a benevolent life or benevolent one. There is indeed an opposition of pains and pleasures, hot and dry, light and heavy. So the true conclusion is that the original source of all these things is entirely indifferent. That's what we said earlier. His solution, God is amoral. These four hypotheses can be formed concerning the first cause of the universe, that they are endowed with the perfect goodness, that they have perfect malice, that they're opposite, and they both have goodness and malice, that they have neither goodness or malice. So these are the four hypotheses. All good, all evil, both, or neither. Mixed phenomenon can never prove the two former unmixed principles, and the uniformity instead of emphasis of the laws seem to oppose the third. So it can't be both good and evil, and it can't be just evil or just good. So it must be neither good nor evil. It can't be just evil. This is important because sometimes students ask this question: what if God's infinitely evil? Well, you can't make something as infinitely evil. Evil is what is opposed to the existence of something. It breaks things down, destroys them. So the fact that there are general laws that keep things going points to God not being infinitely evil. If he's a little bit good and a little bit evil, they would cancel each other out. So he must be neither good nor evil. What I've said about natural evil also applies with little or no change to moral evil. We have no reason to infer that the uprightness of the supreme being resembles human uprightness, and that his benevolence resembles human benevolence. Indeed, it will be thought that we have more reason to exclude from him moral feelings, because many people think that moral evil predominates over moral good. So every effect must have a cause, and that cause must have another. And so you must either carry on the sequence ad infinitum or bring it to an end with the original principle, who is the ultimate cause of all things. Wait, exclaimed Demea. Demea, this whole time for 11 parts, has thought he and Philo are on the same page. Cleanthes has been warning Demea. He's a mystic skeptic. You're not. And so now he jumps in. Where has your imagination taken you? I allied myself with you in order to prove the incomprehensible nature of the divine being and to refute the principles of Cleanthes, who wants to measure everything by human rules and standards. There's a third option. Not human rules and standards, but by reason itself. But now I must find you agreeing with all the views of the greatest libertines and infidels, and betraying that holy cause which you seem earlier to embrace? Are you secretly then a more dangerous enemy than Cleanthes himself? Uh-oh. Has it taken you this long to see that? Replied Cleanthes. We get some drama in the dialogue. Interpersonal dramas that people draw people to movies. Believe me, Demia, your friend Philo has from the outset been amusing himself at my expense and at yours. And I must admit that the innocuous reasoning of our common theology has given him all too good a handle for ridicule. The total infirmity of human reason, the absolute incomprehensibility of God's nature, and the great universal mystery or misery and still greater wickedness of man, these are strange themes surely to be so fondly cherished by an Orthodox churchman and professors in ages of stupidity and ignorance. Have you ever wondered that? That's interesting. There could be ages of stupidity. Ages where, of course, in those ages, people think they're very bright and clever. Part of not being very smart is you think you're very smart. And so that's not the way to judge. Like, well, this is an age of stupidity. Well, I'm very clever, so it must not be. But these come in ages. Age of enlightenment, age of darkness. It'd be worthwhile to reflect, I wonder what kind we're in and why. So Philo jumps in. Don't blame the trouble so much on the ignorance of these. Oh, sorry, I didn't finish this. In ages of stupidity and ignorance, indeed, these principles may safely be espoused. The principles of Philo, maybe they sound good in an age of stupidity and ignorance. But at present, he gets interrupted. Don't blame the trouble so much on the ignorance of these reverend gentlemen, interrupted Philo. They know how to change their system with the times. But now that men have learned to form principles and draw conclusions so that religion depends on arguments rather than how you feel and how you have been indoctrinated, it is necessary to bring some different guns to bear and to make use of arguments that can survive at least some scrutiny and examination. In this way, Philo continued to the last his spirit of opposition and his condemnation of established opinions. But I could see that Demia didn't at all like the last part of what he said, and soon after he made some excuse and left. So Philo says this: you may still believe religious things, but you need a sound argument to do so.